Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Women, Career, and Life podcast. This is your host, Dr. Sirisha Kuchimanchi, a former tech executive at Texas Instruments, a Fortune 200 company, a speaker, a working mom, and an avid reader. In this podcast, you will hear stories and practical advice for you to achieve your career and life goals. I also want to say a big thank you to our listeners for continuing to support this podcast and making it in the top 30% of Spotify podcasts. If you want to continue to support this indie-produced show, you can either buy me a cup of chai, I am not a coffee drinker, or you can become a monthly or annual subscriber. You will find more information in the show notes. I also love listening to other podcasts and you to recommend these shows because I think it will just expand what you might like listening to. Take a listen as the host describes what they do in their show. I am Dr. Sirisha Kuchimanchi. I'm a former tech executive, a podcast host for Women, Career, and Life, and an entrepreneur. We will talk more about our podcast. We are actually 3 podcasters, all women in STEM, very passionate about this, that we thought we wanted to do this session and bring our stories, our experiences, and the stories we hear online and in our own podcasts. Lenny and Kathy, thank you for being here. Lenny, why don't you introduce yourself and let's jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone, whoever's watching this live on the replay. And I hope that if you're watching it on the replay, you play along with us and add your comments as we go through this conversation. My name is Lennis. I am known as the Chief Wellness Engineer. I founded my own company in 2016. I worked as a chemical engineer for 16 years, and I've had multiple burnout experiences, which led me to the current work that I do. I'm also a Chopra certified meditation teacher. I got my certification a couple of years ago through Chopra Global, and I have had the privilege of spending time with Dr. Deepak Chopra, which was a fantastic experience. So I try to bring that balance of well-being as priority for women in STEM and all professionals and students in STEM, because I think it's really important to manage stress and prevent burnout.
Yes, absolutely. And, we will dive into the wellness piece of it because that is all about self-care and making sure there's a lot of discussion, especially post-COVID. I think it's hit a spotlight on us and what we need to do. Mm-hmm. Kathy, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, thank you. And so glad to be with both of you today. I love the work that both of you are doing. So I'm just really honored to be on this fireside chat with both of you. So thank you. I am a telecommunications engineer. So I have an electrical engineering degree. I worked at the same company at a utility for 25 years. During that time, I also was on the board of an industry trade association, which is an experience that was really life and career changing for me. And then I chaired that from 2017 to 2018. I was the first woman chair. I was the first chairwoman of the board of a 70-year-old trade association. So I think that that's a little bit crazy. I then went to work at a small startup radio manufacturer, did that for a couple of years. And then I went into my current role, which is working as an engineer in a consulting firm, but I deal more with strategy than I do with design. And so looking at a higher level. And as we talked about, I started a podcast 3 years ago, which we'll get into, which has been something that has been one of the best things that I've done in my career. And so as we get into this conversation, I'm just really excited to talk about the way that our paths move, because I don't know that any of our paths were really what any of us thought they would be when we started out. So I think that that's a really important conversation to have. So thank you so much for having this chat.
Yeah, it's totally interesting, right? We would never have crossed paths if all of us didn't, for some reason, pivot to talk about women in STEM or careers. In my case, I spent a lot of time talking about advancing women in career and leadership. So I did a very brief intro. So I worked in the tech industry for 17 years in manufacturing engineering operations for a semiconductor company and have had a couple of segues. I've gone through a layoff experience early in my career. I've been a stay-at-home mom for a few years. I've gone back to graduate school during that time to get my PhD. And the reason I want to share these experiences is many of you might be going through various segues, various places and crossroads that you're trying to decide to make decisions. And I think what you learn from all our stories and all the stories we have heard is there is no one size that fits all, and we will all have different pathways. I started my podcast 1.5 years ago as a way to share questions we might have, answers we are looking for when you're trying to move ahead. And then I've sort of essentially pivoted since then. I've actually quit my corporate job and do a radio show, started my own business, a South Asian community for women for career and financial empowerment. So we have all used the STEM as a core, a launching pad for everything else we've done, and we continue to still believe in it. So I know when we've talked in the past, we've been talking about being authentic, like how do we show up? And I feel like I'm more centered now and being more of who I am now than in some ways before. And I think the struggle for me and maybe many people who are immigrants, first generation, is trying to figure out who and which face, and literally I mean face, you show up with at work. It's hard to decide, and it's a continuous evolution in progress. So I was wondering how, for both of you, Kathy, maybe you take this first. How do you feel that journey has been for you, and how you show up now at work?
Yeah, so great question. And how I show up now, and I was just thinking about this today because I have a daughter who's graduating from college. It was 30 years ago that I graduated from engineering school. And how I show up now is 180-degree difference than how I showed up 30 years ago when I started my career at a utility. I was very much focused on being one of the guys and not appearing to be different. And I think at the time I had to. I was literally the first woman in my company that was ever out in the field. And I felt like a lot of pressure with that. And I would also say very intimidated by the fact, and this is like more so with like the technicians that I worked with than the engineers that I worked with. I felt intimidated by the fact that I was the only woman. I was very young and I didn't know anything about the utility industry, right? Like I think you expect when you graduate from college, you're supposed to like come with this like great set of knowledge, which is so far from the truth. But I think that that's what your expectation is. And so I very much felt like I hid, like I baked and decorated cakes. I made my own clothes at the time. I never talked about anything like that. I learned to golf so that I could go golfing with people that I worked with. And I was very much not my authentic self. I don't honestly, and the thing that I think is interesting is that now I don't even know like who my authentic self is. I very much like show up as who I am now, but part of that of who I am now comes from those experiences as well. So I like to golf. So I do still golf, and I do find it much more important though to be who I am. And I want girls and women that are starting their careers and that are in their careers to feel like they can be themselves. They can dress how they want to. They can wear makeup. They can do whatever you want to be. This is just a job, you know, like this is just one facet of our lives. And it's important. And what we bring as our authentic selves is critical, right? Like, I don't know why I felt like I had to hide that I was a woman in engineering, you know, as opposed to celebrating it. You know, like those perspectives should be valued and should be celebrated as opposed to being hidden. So I have a completely different viewpoint now. I have some regrets. I don't know that I would have done anything differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely love what you're saying, Kathy, and I can completely resonate as what is known that syndrome of trying to fit in, be one of the boys and not embracing our gifts in general. And I feel that authenticity currently is a very loaded label and word. And the way that I like to think of it is think about my identity and think about what are the natural gifts, what are the natural things that are innate to me, that are just come natural. Like I don't have to force it, because a lot of times I was forcing who I was to make sure that I was not crossing any lines. I was raised with the mentality of you have to, obviously the values of being respectful, but also I was taught that I had to show up before my boss and I had to leave after my boss. That's how I show up, that I was committed to my work and I will be a good worker. And a lot of my identity in the early years was attached to what I was doing at work. And through that entire process, a decade into the career, I became completely lost just because I was going through the process of checking the society boxes. Okay, I have to go to college. I have to graduate. Then I got married. Then I got the house. And and I had the stable job and I had all these things happening for me. And everyone will praise us, me and my husband at the time, about you're such go-getters, such high achievers. And inside I was so lost. I had no idea who I was. So when I think about authenticity now, I went to a session at South by Southwest in Austin, and this question was brought up and someone said, well, it's about your values. I hope that you evolve as a human and as you grow, but I think your values are the ones that stay constant. And to me, that didn't resonate because my values also evolve. Because sometimes as you go through the phases in life, family takes priority and becomes your value number one. Or, self-care. If your body is screaming at you and you need to pay attention, that has to become a priority. And now the value is how to keep myself healthy and protected. So to me, it's just authenticity boils down to knowing who I am in the sense of what are my gifts? What are the things that come natural? And what am I learning through this whole process of what are things that I enjoy? What are things that I used to enjoy and I don't enjoy anymore? It's just allowing myself to evolve. And I think as women, we put a lot of pressure on how we have to show up. And something came to me the other day that was high IQ does not equal high self-worth. And to me, that just came because I was thinking about my journey and how I was chasing knowledge. I was chasing being the best. I was chasing perfection. And I was really giving a lot of value to my knowledge and intellection. And my EQ, emotional intelligence, was just completely ignored because as women in STEM, in the workplace, you don't talk about emotions. You don't, show certain emotions. You don't cry in meetings. You don't make the men uncomfortable because you may be going through some personal things, hormonal things. That's no-nos. So to me, it's like, that's actually what lowers your self-worth, is not being able to show up as a whole self. So now I'm trying to change that whole dynamic and learning how am I going to show up every day.
There's so much to unpack in this. So, we'd love for you to drop comments in the chat. We are looking at this through StreamYard, so we can't see the things on LinkedIn. So please drop stuff in the chat so we can see everything that you're saying. And just give me a second. I'm going to put this on LinkedIn as well, so I can see if there's comments coming in there as well. And I wanted to, when you're talking about the experience for me is because one of the things that I noticed is I had this feedback early on in my career, somewhere, when I showed up for an interview and someone offered to give me feedback. And one of the things they asked me is, it's very hard to, the discussion led to this basically. What I ended up telling them was I was checking my briefcase at the door, which was who I was, because I was trying to understand culturally. I think you also said, working with the guys, I thought I had to come very serious to work, sort of, I didn't realize it, but I was showing up a certain way at work. Mm-hmm. And after that discussion, I felt like it was a huge change for me. It was like one of those intersection, critical conversations for me that was very important on how I showed up and how I did it. So when I took on more leadership roles, my leadership style might be quite different from some of the others because it's about, a lot of it is around collaboration, and very much, Lynn, is what you're saying about leaning into what comes more natural to me now, what I feel more comfortable with it. It's reaching out to people that I may not be working with today, but as an opportunity to say, where can we intersect? Where can we work? Or where can I learn? Because it changes, right? Structurally, we've always had a certain way of doing things, and it's trying to figure that out. And Kathy, you work in the utility industry. I work, a large part of my work time has been with either customer services or with manufacturing. So, when you're working with people with different experiences, different expertises, and from where they come, it's trying to blend in and trying to figure out the best way to connect so that you can move forward. And being your authentic self is a bit of a challenge, but it's trying to figure out. And I think for me, I think having mentors and people to talk to is so important, because we're having this discussion as very intrinsic to us, but I think there's such a humongous extrinsic portion that we need to figure out how to do it, right? One of the reasons we probably each do the podcast is, yes, there's an intrinsic need for doing this, but there's also an extrinsic space for me to want to connect with others and see that, hey, you're not alone. When you talk about, there are all these words that have become like very much in the space about representation and everything, but it's really about finding mentors. I had a mentor when I was in graduate school, and I wish I remembered her name. At that point, email accounts disappeared. But the one thing I remember is she worked in NASA on the Hubble telescope, and that was just the coolest thing ever. And we ended up talking about, because I was going through, like you said, life changes, was going to get married. I was wondering, how do you manage two, both couples, couple working? What does, childcare look like in the future? There's so many intersection points, Lenny, as we're trying to check these boxes of life, as you called it, and trying to figure out. So you need to find people and spaces to talk to folks. And so the reason that I became more and more interested is I have two young boys in high school. But this picture, and I really have this physical picture at home. And the first time when I noticed it, it made me think a lot about it. So there's this picture of 40 kids. My son's 7th grade math and science team is going to the state tournament. There are 40 kids in this, all dressed in the same clothes with the teachers on the side. And then I looked at the picture and I had to count. There were like 6 girls. I'm like, wait, what is wrong with this picture? Like, why are there 40 kids and 6 girls? And this is only 7th standard, right? And 7th grade. And there's a lot of conversations about high school girls and STEM, but I kept seeing the sort of parting of ways early on. And I had this conversation often with different people, and it starts to part early. Like, what can we do? So it's this intersection of mentoring is a brief conversation. Like, I've had conversations, when I do carpool with high school girls or their classmates or young women in different places. Like, I met someone recently, and it's the messages, I don't know, subliminally we convey, or the environment, or that you hear around you, or what is it that makes us doubt ourselves, right, in some ways. And why do we not feel confident? Because you are so capable. I mean, they're all like so skilled and showing up at work and using those skills and pushing forward. And I think that's why you need mentors and community support and people around you that are going to be positively impacting your energy and what you end up showing up as. Don't forget to subscribe to my Substack newsletter. The links are in the show notes. If you're looking to partner with me for keynote speaking on women leadership, financial independence, or graduate school and beyond, check out my website and reach out to me. Stay tuned in and listen to the rest of the podcast. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, the environment is really important, right? Like for me, engineering was like a normal option because I grew up in Venezuela and my dad was an engineer. My brother was an engineer. I had female cousins going to engineering school. I saw that the leadership in the oil companies, there were women in leadership. So to me, it was normal to go into engineering. Then I come to the US and I see that the landscape is completely different, and especially for immigrants in the Latino community. A lot of the jobs that the parents take are blue collar jobs, and they're not as exposed, right, as you're growing up, to science, to engineering, to math. And if you are, you don't see yourself in those pictures. You don't see yourself as someone that could go in that direction because there's not a lot of representation. So kind of going back to what you said earlier, it's like, yeah, representation does have an impact on the next generations. And I think thankfully in an era that we live right now where we have access to technology and we have access to different platforms, we're going to be able to expose more young girls to the different possibilities of what they can pursue if their desire is there.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I talk about this quite a bit on my podcast recently, is the importance of media and representation of girls and women in STEM in media, because I think it does start at a very early age. And I don't think it's necessarily showed like TV shows and movies and books about women and girls in STEM. I mean, that's important too in those lead characters, but I think just the side characters, instead of having a female receptionist or waitress or whatever, why can't it be a chemist? Why can't it be an engineer? Why can't it be a mathematician? You know, something that's in STEM, so it becomes normal as part of like our normal society to see that. It's like your point of being in Venezuela and you have this representation and you see that, like seeing that as girls are growing up, so that when they are in 7th grade or elementary school, they don't think it's abnormal to sign up for math team or robotics league or whatever. It just should be a normal part of our world and just a normal job for women to do.
Yeah, very true. And, you know, even my experience in India is very much that I was surrounded by women who were, you know, all of my friends, we all went into STEM. Very much the environment was similar. Only the conversation actually for me, interestingly, was when I came to the US and I started to work. And that's when I heard this conversation around women in STEM. And as my kids went to school and I saw these pictures, that I started to think more about it. And when you're talking about representation, even when you're talking about TVs and movies, right, it's important to show, I mean, think about if you were to look at like a lot of the teen movies and stuff, it's if you're sort of nerdy and geeky, there's such a very negative connotation with it. It's not in India, actually, it's a cool thing to be geeky and nerdy. It's kind of like looked upon as a positive thing. And then you come here and you're like, wait, that's not cool anymore. But then you, and the reason I think it's very important, I was having this conversation with a friend whose, you know, kids are in like middle school and the kids are thinking the same thoughts. But look at everybody that's having a huge impact. Let's talk in different perspectives. From an economic standpoint, STEM careers have a huge impact. Like they're one of the higher paying jobs. This is assuming people are inclined and interested. If you have other interests, it's not to force you to do STEM. But if you even have a thought of it, I think you shouldn't self-limit and self-doubt and put yourself away, but look for resources and opportunities to move forward. And there's such a huge economic impact. You know, it bridges the investment gap, pay gap, and all of that. There's pluses there. The other part is you look at AI, machine learning, all the technology that's going to come forward. There's going to be a huge impact on the workforce, on jobs that are out there. So if you're part of the technology development, then you have an opportunity to have an impact there rather than be impacted in some ways. And no matter which field, in some ways, we're all creators, right? We do podcasting, which is more a creative pursuit. Without the technology, we wouldn't be able to do anything. We're trying to optimize it. I use ChatGPT for things. I'm using all these softwares for transcription and everything. So there are ways to combine both aspects of yourself. And if you're interested is to see how to venture out and how to look at that as you move forward as well.
Well, and I think to your point about, like all the technology that is being created, we need the diversity. We need the diversity in gender. We need the diversity in ethnic backgrounds. We need all of that diversity in order to make that technology work for everybody. Otherwise, it only works for white men.
Mm-hmm.
True. I heard this story from somebody on the LinkedIn, you know. The planes apparently have these really high baggage claim, which, you know, most of us can't reach, which is really high because of the way it was designed by men for their height. And it's very hard. And this is an anecdotal story similarly about Amazon's Alexa, because it took a long time for it to recognize the voice of women, because it was designed with men in mind. So technology products that are being designed, software that's being designed, machine learning, all of it. I found this interesting actually when I met Lennis, that trip that I met her on. I was driving back, and this is about support and community, and it's kind of a segue for women in STEM. I had my GPS apologize to me twice, and it made me think for a second. And my GPS is a women's voice, so I don't know if it was gender specific or just the GPS. And for no reason, it said take 35 north or whatever, or 367 exit, and then it stopped and repeated and said, sorry, I'm going to repeat myself. And I was like totally surprised. Why is it doing this? And I'm kind of using this as a segue to conversation when we're talking about support and having that. For me, the other part that when we are advocating for ourselves, when we are trying to move, if you're choosing to advance in your career, or pivot or take a side step, or whichever way, is to be able to ask for what you want, understand and get clarity on what you want, and not apologize. I get that's where I'm trying to do. Not apologize in meetings either. If you show up late, reframe the conversation saying, it's not like you usually show up late. You shouldn't make that a habit, but show up and say, thank you for your patience. Let's talk about this. If you haven't got a chance to prepare or get some inputs for a meeting, then say, I'm waiting on these inputs. This is where our decision points are. Let's meet and have an agenda. So think about how you show up in these conversations, how you prepare for them, and reframe sort of the step back. I feel like this apologetic sort of where we kind of try to close ourselves off in that space, but really show up very positively and say, hey, this is what's going on. This is what's going. Listen to the conversation in the room, like how people are talking and how they're showing up, and try to use those words, because our voice, sometimes they say the voices are not amplified in a room. Like if you have a suggestion and someone else says that maybe their voice is heard, how can you amplify others' voices? Because this is true of all occupations probably, but in STEM more specific, because you're usually 20-30% of the demographic. So how can you amplify other women's voices when you're doing this as well?
Okay, so I'm not going to answer your question right away. I'm going to go back to something that you said at the very beginning of what you said about the woman's voice on GPS, because this is something interesting that I was recently told, is that women's voices are on GPS because women are service providers. We're support characters, and that's why it's a woman's voice on GPS, which honestly really, really surprised me. And it plays into our conversation about the importance of normalizing and the importance of representation. But it's interesting because you think about it, after I heard this, I thought about it. You don't hear men's voices on GPS unless it's recorded by somebody else. Apparently that's a thing, which sounds pretty cool. And when you are on, say, a tram or something like that, it's always a woman's voice. Which I thought was really an interesting thing that I had never noticed or thought about before. So I'm sorry to deviate from what your main question was.
Yes.
That was just this, it was literally last week I heard this, and so I just had to point that out.
Yeah, I love you bring this up, because there's a lot of different biases that we deal with that are unconscious. A lot of unconscious biases from the culture, from the way we were raised, etc. I do see that Angelica dropped a question on how did you become comfortable with presenting your ideas in a room where you are the only woman? I struggle with this. I work on a team of all men. Yeah, I mean, I can say that I had to reframe my mindset. I really had to work a lot on my mindset and just say that I can provide value here. And even if my idea does not get implemented, at least I am putting myself out there and getting more and more comfortable with them seeing me as someone that has ideas, them seeing me as someone that has a voice. And it's almost like you have to train yourself, but you also have to train the people that you surround with. And the other thing is, I know one of the things that I've heard from the women that I've interviewed that great leaders do is to make sure that everyone in the room gets a chance to share, to talk, to say something. And if you are not in a team where your leader is presenting those opportunities, it's a matter of maybe finding a mentor within your organization to help you get into that mindset of, I'm going to add value here, regardless of the outcome. I personally get very attached to the outcome. So sometimes that's why I wouldn't speak up my ideas, because I was like, oh no, they're going to dismiss it. And it's not about what the outcome is. It's about you having the courage to show up and share your ideas, because you may say something that everyone can be completely surprised. And I actually have a story in my last job. This was the beginning of COVID, and the company was doing really great. And we had been on a salary freeze. And the CEO is going through the presentation and saying all these things that we're doing great. We made more profit than we were expecting, this and that. And this was in front of the entire company. And when he said, do you have any questions? I raised my hand and I said, yes, are we going to get a salary raise, a salary increase? And you could hear the silence, like the energy completely shifted. But then I got emails and text messages from my coworkers, and it's like, thank you for asking. We were thinking about it, but nobody had the courage to actually say anything. So think about that. Like, what is something that you want to bring, an idea that you can be the courageous one in there, that maybe your colleagues are also thinking, but they don't have the courage to say it.
Yeah, and Angelica, one more thing to Lennis, is to add to that is, if you're not sure, this is a thing that works if you're new to a group or new to a meeting, say you're leading a team, is go and meet some of the people who are the decision makers, some of the people who are going to be in that meeting room, like one-on-one, and get to know why they are coming to that organization, or what do they want out of it. That way you've made some connections. So when you speak up, or when you are saying something, there are people who are listening and who will echo your thoughts. And that gives you some more space to be more vocal about things, because it takes courage for all of us to show up for sometimes in certain difficult conversations. Like you said, everyone has this question. It's like, I think of it like a classroom. No one ever wants to raise their hand and ask the teacher the question, though no one understands anything she's taught for probably the last 30 minutes. We'll all just go back home and, complain about it. But how can you build connections? And I find it incredibly important to build those connections beforehand and not during a time of crisis, because during a time of crisis, everyone's, under pressure, stress, tempers fray. But when you lean into those connections, even for tech jobs, wherever, that's when it comes through. So think about how else you can do. And please continue to drop your questions in the chat, as we continue to answer them. It's great to hear feedback from folks who are experiencing some of the stories we've had. Kathy, what's been your journey in this?
Journey in general, or journey as in speaking up to answer?
Speaking up in meetings, like finding that space, because you said you were one of few, and as we started, we said we were often trying to be like the guys, or thinking what we thought we should show up as.
So I will say it took me a while to find my voice. I also make a joke that when I found my voice, I never shut up, which is a whole nother issue that can also be challenging, is also making space for other people to talk and making sure that you're listening. But what I think is important is you need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And by being uncomfortable, you will develop a comfort level. So the first time that you speak up, it's going to be hard. The second time you speak up, it's going to be hard. The third time you speak up, it's going to be hard, but it will get easier. And I think it's really important to practice. So maybe you could practice in less intense environments. Like public speaking is something I had a really hard time with. So I'm going to kind of just compare this to public speaking. I started lecturing at my church as a way to make myself comfortable being in front of a large audience in something that's a little bit less intense, and I'm just reading. But it gave me some comfort level when I would go to do public speaking. And I think the same, so maybe if you are in, some kind of smaller environment, if you go to say a Society of Women Engineers meeting or something like that, and you speak up in that setting, and you just start like making inroads and making yourself comfortable, and speak up in those meetings. Like don't just be a wallflower. Like it will take some time and you will be uncomfortable, but you will get comfortable with it.
Yeah, so true. And I wanted to, circle back to something, Lennis, when you were doing your introduction, you're talking about burnout and self-care. I was having this discussion with someone, actually going to be sitting on a panel talking about burnout because it's around setting boundaries. Oftentimes, so, in different career intersection points, when you come early or when you're trying to leave early, when you're trying to manage, sort of this work-life choices, balance, whatever we call them, and I had to pick up kids. I remember someone asking me, "Oh, you're leaving at this time." And at that point, I had no response to like give. It's like that 2 hours later when you go home and you're like, man, I should have said this. Or you didn't feel, kind of confident enough or safe enough to say it. But the thought that popped in my head immediately when that person made that comment was, I finished my work. I figured out how to be efficient at it and how to be much more productive at it. And I'm done with it. And I'm able to, work on new projects. But we're often caught off guard by these comments that someone might choose to make or, how we do it. A lot of companies and workplaces are supportive, but there's also a lot of microcultures that exist within a corporate structure, right? Companies can have values and stuff, but there are microcultures within groups, within organizations that we all set up. So there are things where we can do to kind of push those and create those spaces. Like, how have you dealt with setting boundaries? Like in the beginning, I remember when I showed back to work after being a stay-at-home mom, I had negotiated with my boss certain work timings. And I mean, he was surprised because after accepting the job, I actually negotiated the time instead of doing it before. And then, I managed it for a few months. He was supportive, and then I sort of, stretched into a normal schedule. But it's hard to have those conversations sometimes, or even draw boundaries and say, these are things I can do. If you can find ways to maybe do it later or figure out what needs to be done. How have you dealt with those situations?
Go ahead, Kathy.
It's hard. And I will say, I grew up in a utility and we were pretty much 40-hour work weeks. And so that is how the first 25 years of my work life was for the most part. I mean, there were exceptions to that. And I also had a CEO at my utility at one point in time. I mean, I probably had 4 or 5 CEOs during the 25 years, but I had a CEO who in every company meeting said, we work to live, we don't live to work. Mm. And that has resonated with me from then on. And I think that that's really important because people will, if you don't set your boundaries, people take advantage of them. So you have to set your boundaries. You need to be very strong on them, whether it's, and the thing that I like to say is, like if you're always operating, I'm blocking myself, but if you're always operating up here, when there's a crisis and you need to operate up here, there's not much threshold there, right? You should be, and your company should support having resources so that you are operating down here. So when there is a crisis, you have the ability to move up and operate at a higher level. If you're always operating up here, you can't. And so, but you need to set those boundaries, whether it's blocking off your calendar of like, I'm not doing meetings after say 5:30, whatever your time frame is, whatever, or I need to take lunch because I need to go for a walk. I need to take care of myself. And then we're going to get into talking about wellness. Super, super important. And you don't want to wait until you're 55 years old and you have like run yourself to the point of like your health is having a crisis because you aren't managing that. You need to manage that. You need to manage that from an early time in your career because you have one body, you have one mind, and you have one spirit, and they all need to be taken care of. And those boundaries are what help you take care of it. Super, super important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will say I completely agree. And I'm so glad, Kathy, that you had a great role model to help you during your career or to show like, okay, this is the culture that and the tone that he was setting for the entire workplace. To me, It's been a lot of unlearning when it comes to boundaries. And that's because even from my childhood, I was like, my parents had no boundaries when it came to work. My dad was in the Army, which, again, depending on the profession. I'm back.
Yeah.
Depending on the profession that you're in, right? He was in the Army. He needed to work some crazy schedules. And I remember as a teenager, we would go to visit him, and it was 10, 11 p.m. and he had 5, 6 people waiting outside to speak with him. He had meetings until 2:00 in the morning. So I grew up with someone with 2 role models that had 0 boundaries. And as I shared earlier, I was taught you get there before your boss and you leave after your boss leaves. And my first day of my first ever job right out of college, my manager asked me, "Can you stay late?" And I said, yes. And then one of the engineers that had been there for about 5 years told me a few weeks later that he went and talked to this manager and said, "That was so unfair. Like, you should have not asked her to stay late. That was completely unnecessary. The job that you had her do didn't need to be completed by like the next day." So I think it was just being tested, right? Like, some managers just really like to test you and to see how much are you willing to give. So as I mentioned, I had a lot of unlearning that setting boundaries was not a bad thing. Setting boundaries is actually a healthy thing. And it serves as being a role model too for other people within your organization, so they also feel comfortable, and especially as you get into more leadership positions where you actually say, "Hey, from this time to this time, I'm not going to be able to answer emails. I'm not going to be checking my phone. Like, even if there's an emergency going on, can you touch base with such and such," right? Delegating. When you're setting boundaries, is communicating what your boundary is delegating who may be in charge in case that you're not available during those times. But it's practice. I say with boundaries, for me, it has to be an ongoing daily practice to get used to it, because that's not something that we are taught or something that we often see, especially as women.
Well, and I think when you start out, people are expecting you as a young person to work harder and work longer. And I think that's a horrible expectation that we have and a horrible tone that we set.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember this similar to what Kathy said, right? The CEO, I remember him saying, we will take as much as you will give. So the thing is, there's always work to fill your plate. The question is, where do you say, here is the lines of enough. And I remember when I was doing one of my transitions to work, I had this supervisor colleague, and one of the things he told me is, make sure you're working a normal schedule. And Kathy, I like your example, because he said, the more you work, and I have this friend who struggled with this, if you keep working, like overworking, like as you were describing, like crazy, like 14, 16-hour days, he said, when you step back, life happens. Maybe I have kids and now I want to step back, or whatever. You want to have a personal life, you want to do something else, and you want to step back. People are going to wonder, what are you doing? Though you're working a normal schedule like the rest of them, you were working 16 hours, now you're working. It's like, what did you do? Your things showed up. And he's like, be very careful. And I had a friend who did exactly the same thing for years. She ended up switching companies, I guess, as a way, not necessarily to break it, but that was an opportunity to break that example. But looks like she's repeating the same thing again. So we keep having conversations around this, because it is very hard to step back. And we all want to do a good job. It's not like we are not driven, we are not passionate. We want to contribute. We know we can, and doing it. But what I found is, sort of, when I look at my early years and, over time, is I learned to figure out what was important, what was urgent, asking those questions, inquiring what really needed to be done, and, driving some productivity around it. If this process took so long, did it need to be done this way? Is there ways to cut it down? What is the efficiency in it? So there are ways to look at how to do it, because think about it, there are a lot of tasks we do which are sort of repetitive and kind of boring and mundane. And maybe, trying to see how to cut it off so you can do the more exciting stuff, something cool. And asking your team the same thing, like other projects that they're doing, other things that they want to make efficient. Really, it comes down to that. If you're able to perform, you're able to do everything that needs to be done, then it gives you bandwidth to try these stretch roles and grow and learn new skills. And I think that's why the boundary condition becomes important. So boundary is two things. Boundary is setting boundaries, but I also want to be clarify that it does not mean you operate inside a box. For me, it's all about coloring outside those lines. Like the box is there as sort of a guideline of, oh, this is your definition of your job, but it's really about all the things that you can do outside. And it depends on who and what your interests and your personality are, on how you want to show up to do these things.
I have a question for the two of you. So one of the things I'm struggling with a little bit right now is I have my day job, right, as at the consulting firm. Then I have my podcast. I started a YouTube channel where I'm trying to do these like technical content videos, to do some education that also that does like play into my like day job a little bit too. I'm trying to start writing some books for girls in STEM, going back to that, like normalizing girls and women in STEM and media. And I'm actually finding that like I'm stepping on my own boundaries and trying to like figure out the boundaries of like the day job, my passionate projects, my family, my kids. And I'm actually like creating like, I'm having a hard time like with my own boundaries from like my side projects. How have you guys found that from a standpoint? Because, you know, we all do our podcast, we all do like our like content creation and the other things that we do. How are you guys managing that?
Well, I'll go first. I think when you are so passionate about something, there's like very blurry lines. For me, it's about what are my non-negotiables in a day, right? What are some of the things that I have to do to fill my cup first before I start pouring into all these other cups that I have on my plate? And having really more realistic time frames. So for example, I remember when I was working full time and I was doing my business and I was doing the YouTube channel and I was like having all these different balls in the air trying to juggle them. I will look at what my projects look like and what times were going to be a little bit easier. So that way I could then use more of my brain power into those passion projects, right? And in my case, I will just set a week where I will batch content for YouTube. So at least I'll have a month ahead. Or, where I could do some planning and I will set an hour aside. And it's like this hour is only planning. I think that the hardest thing for me was to let go of the myth of multitasking and really set specific times for things, right? Like we have this specific time for this conversation. It's in my schedule. I know what's going to be expected. I know lunchtime is coming right after this. So yesterday I pre-made some vegetables and some things in the evening. So I knew when I was done with this call, lunch will be a lot easier, right? So how can I simplify some of the daily tasks so I don't get overwhelmed or I don't get into that mindset of I can do 3 things at the same time, because it's such not helpful and we don't do our best job. We don't show up as our best when we do that. And then I will go into my own self-punishment when I would do that too. So it's a whole other story.
So mine is going to be a little different. So I had the same problem, Kathy, full-time job, kids and work and everything else. And I took a step back. Part of the reason, when it's a trigger point for this transition of leaving corporate life for me, was about time. Time became my biggest constraint in a way. And I was trying to see where I wanted to focus it, because to me, my kids are going to head off to college soon. And I was like, well, let's clarify, they're teenage boys. But as much time as I could spend with them, I was going to spend hanging out with them. So I had to decide where it is, because I remember a colleague asking me once they saw me, posting on LinkedIn about my podcast. He's like, when do you do it? I said, yeah, I go to bed like at 12 and 1, because I was doing it after I went home so that I didn't blur the boundaries between work and personal life. They were like very distinctly different, like different laptops, different phones, everything different. And I realized when I was starting to drop things that it became hard. So when you're talking about boundaries, I'm not saying to take such a drastic decision, but it became clear on what decisions I wanted to make when. And then you were talking about batching and all of this. But I have to be, on the flip side, I have to be incredibly careful now when I'm working for myself to not be burnt out. I realized that in the beginning that I'm doing all these things, like scrambling all over the place. And there are some days I will say, okay, I'm just not going to bother, because the pressure is mine on myself. No one's asking me to do these things. There is no question of, if you look at ROI like an engineer and what's going to happen, I have no idea how it's going to turn out. So I have to be like, I am not going to do this. Or today I'm like, I'm going to set this network up. I might get to it, I might not. There are like things on my calendar that I'm very clear about putting. Some things when I set up meetings are non-negotiables, but other things are like, yes, maybe. Even social media, I struggle with doing social media on LinkedIn and Insta, and I've decided Insta is there for certain engagement, but it's also not my comfort zone, and I've decided to focus on where I feel comfortable, which is LinkedIn, because it just is easier for me, I guess, maybe coming from that environment. And I'm like, I know I'm supposed to do all the social media, and I started, and I'm like, cut it all back, and I'm like, this is all I can manage. I prefer talking to people, meeting them for coffee or chai or whatever, and that is what I'm going to do. And drawing those boundaries around that space of like, here is what I'm going to do. So one of the things I did, so I took a leave of my absence before I quit my job for 3 months. And I realized within the first week that, like, any time when you're trying to do your own thing, the time can just go away. Like the river flows and it's gone. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I guess the engineer had in me, I wanted like a sense of achievement. So I created this Excel sheet, and every day I would write, what did you do? What was your single win? The single win could be, I connected with Kathy on LinkedIn. It could be as simple as that. It could be anything. I met a friend. I went for a walk. It didn't matter what it was. Something that I could count as a win, and then there would be like big ones. And what did I do? And I had some kind of goals, because that gave me like what was important and what was not. Like, what did I want to do at the end of that 3 months to say, okay, I felt like, I took this time to reflect on something. How was I going to drive those decisions? What were those decisions going to be? And would I feel like I hit it, or the time just flew by? So it doesn't have to be all about being productive as much as what is it that, you want to do. And it's very hard to decide. And we are constantly changing and evolving. Today, what I think is important is completely not important tomorrow. And then you might wonder, what did I do that before for? But that's how you learn. So it's an evolution in progress. And I don't know if we answered your boundary condition exactly the way you're looking at it. Maybe it gives ideas for others listening as well, what they can do differently.
Yeah. One thing that came to mind, Kathy, is like, get yourself a project manager for your passion projects, because that way.
The passion projects don't make any money, so that's the problem.
Yeah, but you should. I agree with some parts of it. I think you should. That was the other thing. You should think about what you can outsource, like little pieces of it, if it's possible to outsource, or actually even better, let it go. Like there are a lot of things I don't even bother with. I either outsource them, or I just, even like at home and stuff. There are a lot of things, if people come, like I'm totally about letting it go. People have to tell me certain things, that's when I will do them. Otherwise, I know this thing of, here is the expectation as, as a parent, as a mom, as a partner, as a this. I am not following the script, because there is no way to keep up with the script. So I'm going to drop a lot of things. And I realize when I talk to friends and they're like, I don't have time. I'm like, oh, all these things that you're doing, I'm not doing them. Mm-hmm. That is why I have time to do my podcast, because I'm not doing most of them. Are they important? Yes, probably they are, but it's a choice I'm making. Is it the right choice? For me, it is the right choice at this point. Tomorrow, it may not be the right decision, or maybe there are consequences for it, but I am going to have to swallow that and decide, hey, this was important for me now, and that's what I'm going to do.
There's one thing you mentioned that is so true, Kathy. When your passion projects are passion projects, not and hobbies, not a source of income, I personally I started outsourcing stuff at home, in the sense of, I have someone who comes and cleans my house, because that was something I didn't enjoy doing, but it was important to me to see my house organized and clean. So I said, you know what, I'm just going to have someone come. I have a job that can pay for that. And that became a non-negotiable. Someone that takes care of the garden. Like, it's these little things that we don't think about as women, because we think we have to do it all. And outsourcing stuff at home was a big time opener for me.
Oh, I think that's a really good point. I have had someone come clean my house since I've had like little babies because I don't enjoy it. I don't like it. I like having my house clean at one time as opposed to like little jobs or along the way. Also, my husband does the cooking during the week because he gets home from work earlier. So I outsource that. So I'm working on the outsourcing of the household activities, which I think is a really important thing. And I think I think to your point about as women, we think that we have to do it all. I think that is really important, like for like women who are listening or men, it's okay to outsource those things. Like I love the woman who comes and cleans my house. Like she is wonderful. And we have great conversations when she's here, when I'm not working on meetings. But yeah, that's a really good important point, because I think some women do feel like they have to do it all.
Yeah, this online grocery shopping, if you don't enjoy going to the store. I mean, there are so many ways to sort of batch process even these tasks, right? You can sort of set it as a repetitive order. You can get someone to cut your vegetables. I mean, like people have outsourced, all of us have tried different things to outsource. To the same point, your passion projects are not necessarily doing. And I think in some ways that is the part of outsourcing, right? And delegating, but sometimes maybe just discard the stuff. Is it even really important to do this task? Like, think about it even from that standpoint. Like, is it a safety, this, certain criteria? Yes. But if it's not, is it something that desperately needs to be done? Or can it be done in once a week, once in 2 weeks, once in 3 weeks? Or is someone else in the family enjoy this part of the job and not that part? And then you kind of trade it out and see what works. Yeah, it's very interesting, right? So much, because when you talk about coming back to the topic about breaking barriers, and for women in STEM, it's not about just the work itself. There's life that surrounds it that impacts everything we do at work, though we never talk about it at work, because you're balancing all these things. You're trying to figure out how to manage this, because I know when sometimes people show up for roles in management, even for me, when I was trying to first be manager, even thinking about it, first of all, I didn't think about it. And secondly, it came out of a conversation I had with a friend. And I was like, oh, I could do it. And, having that conversation with my boss, it was understanding what you can ask for, what you're willing to do, because you're wondering about all these, oh, can I go home early? Can I pick up my kids? Can I still make the soccer game? It holds a lot of people back on these discussions. But I think the workplace has changed so much that people can have those discussions at work. Men and women leave for soccer games. They have personal lives. And it's about saying, like you said, I'll take the calls between 5 and 8. I'll be at soccer game, or, I have to do this, or I have my own painting class that I need to go to. Or you don't even have to tell what you're going to, that you are going to create the space for yourself and let others do their stuff.
Well, I think that's part of bringing our authentic self to work, right? Is being able to have the conversations about, I have aging parents, I have young kids, I have whatever it is, or honestly, you don't have to have any of those things. You should still just be able to have a life, right? You should be able to be like young and single and still be able to have a life and not be expected to have every waking hour devoted to work. But I think having those conversations and just understanding, and I think, like, honestly, I think this is like one of the things that I think that COVID has brought to the forefront, is we see people's personal lives. Like we're all in each other's rooms right now. We're all in each other's houses. I'm surprised my dog hasn't come up to say hi. People's kids are hopping into calls. I love that. I think that that's a super, super valuable thing, because we get to see more of people's lives, for good or bad, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's just part of bringing our authentic self to work, is being able to have those conversations.
Yep. As we're getting ready to wrap up, I wanted you to talk about what you do outside, talk about your podcast, any other resources you want to share, so that if people want to follow you, want to reach out, want to understand more about the work, or find a community. Lennis, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Yeah, for sure. So I am the co-host of a podcast called Take a Break with a fellow woman in STEM, Caroline Milton. May is a busy month for me because it's Mental Health Awareness Month. As I shared at the beginning, I've experienced burnout. I've experienced anxiety and depression, especially as a young woman in STEM, and feeling quite isolated. So I am a huge advocate for mental well-being. and I'll be having some online presentations that people can sign up for free. And right now, I'm working on a super exciting project, and I'm kind of restarted. I love going through research process at least twice a year. Last year, I did a research on role models for women in STEM, and I published an article or a paper that was the outcome of these interviews of 30 women in STEM and kind of what they what worked for them, what they wanted to see from leaders, what they wanted to see from organizations. So very actionable items with a lot of privacy in terms of who shared this information. It was just collecting the data and just presenting it in a way that actually led to some other collaborations. But right now, it's about the research project I'm working on is for women who have at least 5 years of experience in STEM. And we were talking at the beginning about this struggle with authenticity, about having this almost inner war of, I want to do this, or why am I not happy if I'm supposed to be happy on paper? So what is really going on, and what are some of the resources that could help you, right? Just having this conversation. So if you are open and willing to share your experience as a woman in STEM who has felt maybe disconnected from their work or from themselves at some point, I would love to talk to you. You can send me a DM on LinkedIn. I'm always checking and having conversations. So feel free to reach out and tell me, hey, I want to help you with your research project for women in STEM. So yeah, that's what I've been working on.
That's wonderful. And I remember reading your, I'm going to call it a white paper. It was a lot of important work and just done so beautifully. So definitely reach out to Lennis to do this.
Thanks.
Kathy?
So I host a podcast called Ordinarily Extraordinary, Conversations with Women in STEM. I have been fortunate to have both Lennis and Sirisha on my podcast. And I just do these very casual conversations talking about what women do for jobs, sharing their stories, and providing a platform for them to talk about what they do and really let their conversations come through. I also recently started a YouTube channel, which I briefly mentioned, where I am creating technical content in animated videos, which actually came out from conversations I've had with people on my podcast who do content creation. I thought I would take a stab at that. So I have one video out so far, but I'm hoping to do more because it's actually kind of fun. And then I am working on this. I don't really talk publicly much, but these are kind of fun. I'm working on kind of 3 different book projects. I have never done any kind of like creative writing or anything before, but working on, and they all have different areas. One is intended to be a picture book that I have found an illustrator to collaborate on a book with, coloring book about women in STEM, and then like a middle school novel. Where these go, I don't know, but those are like my three of my little passion projects that I'm also working on in order to normalize women in STEM in media. Mm-hmm. So those are my projects.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and I enjoyed our chat on the podcast as well, because those are conversations we need to be having. So I host a podcast, Women, Career, and Life. You can find it when I post on LinkedIn or any podcast platform. It's about sharing stories and advice so you can move forward in your career. The title says women, but interestingly, 30% of the listeners are men, and it's a top 30% Spotify podcast. So check it out. We have really wonderful guests sharing their experiences. I recently launched a business, Sahita, which is a global platform for South Asian women for career and financial empowerment. You can find more information by going to sahita.live or just DMing me on LinkedIn. And though it says South Asian women, I do want to make it that it's the content is targeted with them in mind, but it's an inclusive community. Others are welcome to join and engage. It's all about really finding a support system, a community. It came out of pain points I saw from my own life and a lot of conversations, as a place to have these sort of open, safe, honest conversations, and also find like-minded women as you're trying to, move forward. You may have communities, you may have friends, but they may not be walking the same path. So it's to be able to lean into these people who are, kind of facing the same challenges or able to support you. So this whole LinkedIn Live, the streaming that we did, this podcast that we will drop, whatever platform we may be on, is really about community, about finding support, about understanding that you're not alone, that you're not the only one facing this, though you might feel like that, and being able to reach out to people. You can DM us, you can email, there are ways to communicate within our community or outside, and finding those folks, because I wouldn't be here if I didn't have people who were helping me along the way, intentionally or just through happenstance conversations. It's those little things in passing that someone says might have a bigger impact than a long-term relationship sometimes. So you never know where you are inspiring others as well. So keep the doors open for people to come in and for you to go out. And I think that's very important to have this. Keep going.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been great. And you guys are all part of the community that I got to be a part of, like, through weird interactions and meetings through podcasting. Like, the community, they just grow, like, organically, honestly. Like, I think it's amazing. So thank you for bringing this all together.
Yes. And I want to say thank you to Kathy and Lennis for agreeing to do this LinkedIn Live and for doing this podcast. You will see this on my feed and probably on their feeds as well. And please reach out to us with questions if you listen to it later on in time. We are more than willing to, hear everyone's stories and help each other out. So thank you. Bye-bye. Have a wonderful day. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
This is an indie podcast. And if you really enjoy the content, you can help me with production by supporting me. You can buy me a cup of chai. I'm not really a coffee drinker. Or you can enable me by subscribing for either a monthly or an annual plan as well. Thank you for doing this. And don't forget to share this episode and put in the reviews what you liked. What was your key takeaway? That's really what I want to know. I want to know how this is impacting you and what's infinitesimal changes you're seeing in your life. You can always reach me through Instagram by sending me a DM at Women, Career and Life. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you next time.